The chamber doors slammed open before Marcus Cole had finished his breath. He'd been standing at his post for 11 hours, spine straight, eyes forward, hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture required of all human liaison officers assigned to the Vaeltheri royal court. The assignment was supposed to be ceremonial, a symbol of the new alliance. A warm body in a dress uniform to prove humanity was serious about peace. Nobody had told him the queen would be dying. She stood at the center of the dais, surrounded by her high council, 7 robed figures whose bioluminescent markings pulsed in agitated patterns Marcus had learned to read over 8 months of careful, silent observation. Anger was amber. Fear was blue-white. The markings he saw now were neither. They were the deep, hemorrhaging red he'd only ever read about in classified briefings, the color the Vaeltheri displayed in the presence of catastrophic loss. Queen Ethera moved like she was holding herself together through sheer will alone. She was tall. All Vaeltheri were tall, nearly 7 feet, their bodies built along lines that suggested both grace and terrible strength. Her skin was the pale silver gray of moonlit water, and the bioluminescent patterns that ran from her temples to her collarbone were normally a steady, authoritative gold. Now they flickered, stuttered, went dark at the edges. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. That was the rule. Liaison officers were furniture, witnesses, background. The High Council was speaking in formal Vaeltheri, a register so elevated that Marcus's translation implant couldn't fully parse it. He caught fragments, words that meant burden and concealment and fracture. The council elder, a figure named Sorvath whose contempt for the human presence had never once been disguised, was speaking directly to the queen with his back turned to the chamber. A deliberate insult to everyone behind him. Ethera's eyes moved. They swept the room in that slow, controlled way Marcus had observed dozens of times. She catalogued everything, always, as if the universe were a document she was perpetually editing. Her gaze passed over the council, over the attendants near the eastern arch, over the ceremonial weapons mounted above the throne, and stopped on Marcus. He felt it like pressure. Not hostile, worse than hostile. Searching. He kept his face neutral. That was training. 8 months of training and 3 years before that learning how to be a still point in a storm. But something happened in the space between 1 second and the next that Marcus couldn't fully explain and would spend a long time afterward trying to. He heard her. Not with his ears. The queen hadn't spoken. Her lips hadn't moved and the implant hadn't chimed. But in the way that a person standing near a fault line sometimes feels the tremor before the instruments register it, Marcus felt the weight of what she was carrying land somewhere in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. She was terrified. Not of the council. Not of the political situation, whatever it was. Terrified in the way that living things are terrified when they understand, with absolute clarity, that the thing they love most is about to be destroyed and there is nothing, not power, not protocol, not a lifetime of careful control, that can stop it. Marcus had felt that exact fear once before. Standing in a hospital corridor on Earth, watching through a small window while surgeons worked on his daughter. She'd been 4 years old and the surgery had taken 9 hours and he had stood in that corridor and not moved and not spoken and held himself together through pure and desperate will because falling apart wasn't something the situation could afford. He hadn't told anyone that story. Not here. Not ever. But, in the space of 3 seconds, with the queen's eyes fixed on his face, and her bioluminescent markings bleeding that dark, catastrophic red, Marcus understood that she already knew it. Or something like it. Or something that lived in the same country of grief. She looked away. The council continued. Sorvatha's voice rose slightly, not loud. The Vaeltheri didn't shout, but There was a sharpening in his cadence that Marcus had learned to identify as escalation. He was pressing something, demanding something. The Queen's posture didn't change outwardly, but Marcus saw her hands, clasped before her in the formal position of reigning authority, tighten until the knuckles went pale. Then the child ran in. She came from the attendant's passage on the left, a small Veiltheri girl, no more than 6 years old by Marcus's estimation, her markings the bright, uncontrolled silver blue of youth and agitation. She was dressed in the layered formal robes of someone who had been prepared for presentation, but had clearly decided presentation could wait. She ran directly to the Queen and grabbed her hand. The chamber went absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of a pause. The silence of a room full of people who understood that something had just broken through every layer of protocol and ceremony and carefully maintained political theater, and nobody, not one person present, knew what came next. The child said something. Short. 2 words, in the informal register, the register of home and family and closed doors. Marcus's implant caught it clearly. She said, "She's gone." The Queen did not move for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly, with the precision of someone choosing each action with the full weight of their will, she closed her fingers around the child's hand and held on. Sorva turned around. The red in Ethera's markings had spread to her throat by the time Sorva finished his turn. It moved like ink through water, slow, unstoppable, the kind of change that happens in the body before the mind has caught up with the news. Marcus cataloged everything. That was his job. That was the only job he had left in a room where every political calculation had just been overturned by a child in formal robes with silver blue grief written across her face. The girl's name, he would learn later, was Velith. She was the Queen's ward, not a biological daughter, but the child of Ethera's closest advisor, a woman named Sarah, who had served the throne for 30 years and had apparently been ill for the last 6 months in a way that the Queen had kept entirely private, which explained several things Marcus had observed and filed away without understanding. Sarah was dead. Velith had found her. And Velith, being 6 years old and Veiltheri and apparently possessed of the same instinct for cutting through ceremony that small children across species seemed to share, had come directly to the one person whose grief she knew would match her own. Sorvatha's voice, when it came, was quiet. Precise. "This is not the time." Ethera looked at him. Marcus had observed the Queen in confrontation before. She had a way of meeting opposition that was less like pushing back and more like becoming unmovable, a quality of stillness that made the person opposing her feel as though they were the one who had moved, who had made the mistake, who had miscalculated. It was extraordinary to watch. He'd spent considerable time in his personal logs trying to describe it accurately. What he saw now was different. She wasn't stillness. She was the moment before the fault line gives. "Leave," she said. 1 word. Informal register. It landed in the chamber like something physical. Sorvatha's markings went amber, not quite anger, something more complex. Challenge mixed with calculation. "Your Majesty, the Succession Council requires, leave." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in the second repetition that communicated, with absolute clarity, that this was not a request and not a warning and not a negotiation. It was a statement of what was about to happen whether or not everyone present chose to cooperate. The council filed out. Not quickly. They had their dignity, and Veiltheri authority figures were constitutionally incapable of hurrying in a way that might be interpreted as retreat. But they left. Sorvath last, and his final look at Ethera contained something Marcus couldn't fully read, something that existed in the gray space between threat and grief. The attendants followed. The ceremonial guards took their positions outside the closed doors. Marcus didn't move. He wasn't sure whether he was supposed to leave. The protocol for this specific situation: Queen dismisses High Council in the wake of private loss. Foreign liaison officer present, didn't exist in any document he'd been given. He defaulted to training. He became furniture. He became background. Ethera sat down on the steps of the dais. Not the throne, the steps. She pulled Velith into her lap and the girl buried her face against the queen's chest, and the sound she made was the same sound children make everywhere when they are very small and the world has handed them something too heavy. Marcus stared at a point on the far wall. He kept his breathing even. He did not look at what was happening 12 feet to his left. He failed at the last part approximately 45 seconds later. He looked, and Ethera was already looking at him. Her expression was, he didn't have a word for it. He'd studied Veiltheri physiognomy extensively, and he didn't have a word for the particular combination of exposure and evaluation in her face. Like someone who had been caught at something and was deciding, in real time, whether to be ashamed of it. He didn't look away. That was the mistake. That was the thing he would replay for weeks afterward, analyzing it from every angle, whether it was protocol violation, whether it was instinct, whether it was something in that strange 3-second moment by the council door where her grief had landed in his chest like a stone. He didn't look away. And she didn't look away. Velith had quieted, exhausted by the first wave of it, her small body going heavy in the queen's arms. Ethera stroked the child's hair in the slow, rhythmic way of someone who has done it many times before, the gesture so automatic it seemed to come from a place below thought. Marcus thought about a hospital corridor. About 9 hours. About the way his hands had shaken when the surgeon finally came through the door with good news, and he'd had to grip the wall to stay upright because his knees had simply stopped working from the relief. He thought about how the only person who'd been there was a janitor mopping the floor 30 feet away, who had looked up and met his eyes at exactly the right moment and nodded once, slowly, and gone back to mopping. How that nod had somehow held him together for the remaining 4 minutes before his wife arrived. He did not plan what he did next. He would make that clear afterward to everyone who asked. There was no calculation, no political strategy, no grand gesture of interspecies solidarity. He simply nodded. Once. Slowly. Ethera watched him do it. Her markings, still the dark hemorrhaging red, didn't change. Her expression didn't change. Velith slept against her chest. Then, very quietly, so quietly Marcus almost missed it, she nodded back. 3 days passed before anyone spoke of it. Marcus filed his observer's report as required, neutral language, factual sequence of events, no interpretation. He noted the council's departure. He noted the presence of the ward. He omitted the moment on the dais completely, and spent 2 sleepless nights deciding whether that omission was a dereliction of duty or the only decent thing available to him. He decided it was the latter, and stopped losing sleep over it. On the 3rd morning, a Veiltheri attendant came to his quarters before the formal day had begun and informed him, in the polished diplomatic register, that the Queen requested his presence in the private reception chamber adjacent to the throne room. Not the throne room itself. Not a formal audience. The private reception chamber, which Marcus had been told existed but had never once been invited into. He dressed in his full uniform. He walked the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back and his spine straight and his face arranged in the careful neutrality that 11 months of practice had made second nature. The chamber was small by Veiltheri standards, perhaps 20 feet across, lit by the soft amber biopanels that the Veiltheri used in spaces intended for rest and informality. There was no dais, no throne. 2 chairs, low and angled toward each other, separated by a table on which someone had placed a ceramic vessel of the warm, slightly bitter drink Marcus had learned to accept without grimacing. Ethera was already seated. She was not in full formal dress. Her markings were the quiet gold of function rather than ceremony, and the expression she wore as Marcus entered was evaluating. Still that quality of someone taking measurements he couldn't fully see. He stopped at the appropriate distance and inclined his head. "Your Majesty." "Sit down," she said. Informal register. The same register she'd used to clear the council from the chamber. He sat. She studied him for a moment. Outside, through the narrow windows, the Veiltheri city moved in its slow morning patterns, vast and pale and organized according to principles Marcus had spent nearly a year learning and still didn't fully understand. "You have been in my court for 11 months, she said, switching to formal Galactic Common, which she spoke with a precise, slightly deliberate cadence of someone who had learned it as an adult. "In that time, you have made no political overtures. You have transmitted 12 observer reports. You have violated protocol once, to retrieve a child who had become separated from her attendants in the lower corridor. You were reprimanded." "I was," Marcus agreed. "The child's attendants were negligent. You were not." Her marking shifted, a faint amber edge, something that might have been irritation at the memory or the larger situation around it. "I am aware that the reprimand was unjust. I did not intervene because the political cost of appearing to favor a human liaison officer over my own court protocols was something I could not afford at that time." "I understand. Do you?" "Not a question. Another measurement. You did not file a complaint. You did not contact your diplomatic supervisors. You accepted the reprimand and continued your duties." Marcus thought about it for a moment before answering. "It was the right call for the situation, Majesty. The child was safe. The relationship between your court and the human mission was more important than my record." Ethera was quiet for a moment. Her markings shifted through something complex, several colors moving through each other in a way his training hadn't given him vocabulary for. 3 days ago," she said, "you were present for something that should not have been witnessed." Here it was. He'd known it was coming. "Yes. I have reviewed the protocol documents you are governed by. There is no precedent for your presence in that chamber under those circumstances, which means there is no prescribed consequence for what you observed." She paused. "And no prescribed requirement for what you chose to do." He met her eyes. "No, Majesty. Why did you not look away?" The question landed with a precision that suggested it had been waiting 3 days to be asked. Marcus kept his breathing even and thought about how to answer honestly without performing honesty, which was a distinction he'd learned mattered to the Veiltheri more than almost anything else. "Because looking away felt like a lie," he said. "I've stood in a corridor and been held together by a stranger who simply didn't look away. It seemed like the least I could offer." Ethera was very still. Her markings had gone quiet, that deep, controlled gold. "Sarah served me for 30 years, she said. The words came with the careful weight of someone choosing to say a thing they have not said aloud before. "She was the only member of this court who spoke to me in the informal register without formal permission. The only one who entered my private chambers when the doors were not explicitly opened." A pause. "She was also the only one who told me the truth when the truth was something I did not wish to hear." Marcus said nothing. This was not a moment for words. "The High Council will push for an accelerated succession review now. They will argue that my display of—" Her markings flickered, a brief, violent amber. "Private grief in a semi-public chamber constitutes evidence of compromised ruling capacity. Sorvith has been waiting for an opportunity of this kind for 4 years. What will you do?" She looked at him with those measuring eyes. I will do what must be done. I will close every private grief behind a door they cannot open. I will present to the council a queen who is made of nothing but function and authority. She paused. It is what the situation requires. Marcus thought about hospital corridors, about 9 hours, about everything he closed behind doors and kept there because the situation required it and because the alternative was falling apart and he couldn't afford to fall apart. Yes, he said quietly. It usually is. Her markings shifted. Something he didn't have a word for, something in the warm spectrum, not quite amber, not quite gold. You heard me, she said. 3 days ago, in the chamber. Before I spoke. You heard something. He held her gaze. I don't know how to explain it. Neither do I. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city continued its slow morning movement. But I have spoken to 3 advisors, 2 council members, and a Veil Theory grief speaker in the 3 days since Sarah died. None of them. She paused again, the pause carrying weight. Heard anything. The silence between them was the kind that forms when 2 people have recognized something in each other that neither has a name for yet. Marcus had experienced it only a handful of times in his life. It always preceded something important. Majesty, he said carefully. What do you need? She looked at him for a long moment. Her markings settled into something steady. Something that, in his 8 months of careful study of Veil Theory physiological expression, he had only ever seen in one specific context. Trust. The truth, she said. In the coming weeks, I will need someone in this court who tells me the truth when the truth is something I do not wish to hear. Her chin lifted slightly. I am told humans are particularly suited to this, given your apparent inability to properly calculate social consequence before speaking. Despite everything, Marcus felt the corner of his mouth move. We do have a reputation, he agreed. The succession review convened 18 days later, and it was nothing like any political confrontation Marcus had ever observed. He was present by formal invitation, Queen's personal liaison, a designation that had caused 3 days of diplomatic turbulence and at least one formal written objection from Sorvath that Marcus had read through twice and found, professionally, rather beautifully composed. The objection argued, in exhaustive detail, that a human officer had no standing in a Veil Theory succession proceeding. It was technically correct and politically irrelevant, because Ethera had invoked a rarely used provision of the Royal Authority Charter that permitted the Queen to designate any member of court, regardless of species or rank, as a personal advisee in formal proceedings. The provision was 800 years old. It had been written to prevent the isolation of a monarch during crisis. Nobody in the current High Council had expected it to be used for this. Marcus sat 3 seats to Ethera's left, at the advisee's position, in a chair that had been ceremonially dusted off for the occasion. He kept his face neutral and his spine straight and his hands clasped in his lap, and he catalogued everything. Sorvath opened the review with a recitation of precedents, 11 cases in the last 400 years where a Veil Theory monarch's public display of non-controlled emotional response had been cited in succession challenges. His markings were the precise, controlled amber of someone delivering a prepared argument with confidence. He had clearly expected this moment for a long time. He was clearly ready. Ethera listened without expression. Her markings were steady gold. When Sorvath concluded, she requested a 3-minute pause before responding. The pause was granted by the review moderator, an ancient Veil Theory jurist named Peleth, who communicated primarily through written notation and whose markings were so faded with age that they barely registered. During the pause, Ethera turned to Marcus. He leaned slightly forward. She spoke very quietly, in formal galactic common, and what she said was, Sarah told me, 4 months ago, that this challenge was coming. She told me the argument Sorvath would use and the precedents he would cite. She told me the response that would neutralize it. A pause. She did not tell me what to do about the fact that the response would require me to publicly acknowledge that I knew she was dying and chose to govern anyway. Marcus considered this for 3 seconds. The acknowledgement is the strength, he said, not the vulnerability. Ethera looked at him. Every precedent he cited involved a monarch who lost control without knowing it was happening. You knew. You assessed the situation, you weighed the cost, and you chose to continue governing because the work required it. He held her gaze. That's not compromised ruling capacity. That's exactly what ruling capacity looks like. Her markings shifted, that warm, unnamed color. She turned back to the review. What followed was 20 minutes that Marcus would replay in his memory for years. Ethera spoke in the formal elevated register with the precision of someone who had been born to exercise power and had spent 40 years getting better at it. She acknowledged Sarah's illness. She acknowledged her own knowledge of it. She laid out, with clinical clarity, every decision she had made in the last 6 months, every governance choice, every strategic call, every political negotiation, and presented them in sequence as evidence of exactly what Marcus had said. Controlled, deliberate, chosen. Sorvatha's amber markings went through 3 different shades as she spoke. By the end, they had settled into something that, in Marcus's estimation, looked remarkably like a person recalculating a position they'd been confident in for years. The moderator Peleth wrote for a long time after Ethera finished speaking. The scratch of his notation instrument was the only sound in the chamber. Then he held up what he'd written. The review clerk read it aloud in a voice so flat it contained no interpretive information whatsoever. Petition for succession review denied. Governing capacity affirmed. Matter closed. Sorvath stood. He was still for a long moment, his markings cycling through something complex and private. Then he inclined his head toward the Queen. The gesture was not warm, but it was precise. And, in Veil Theory political language, precision was respect. He left without speaking. The chamber began its slow exhale. Council members moved and murmured. The moderator gathered his materials. The attendants began the formal dismissal protocols. Marcus sat very still and let the storm pass around him. He felt the Queen's gaze before he turned to meet it. When he did, her expression was the same one he'd seen in the private reception chamber, that quality of someone who has done a very difficult thing and is standing on the other side of it, taking stock. Her markings were steady gold with the faintest edge of that warm, unnamed color at the borders. She said nothing. There were too many people in the room and the political theater of the moment required careful management, and she was already managing it with the practiced ease of 40 years on a throne. But she nodded. Once. Slowly. Marcus held her gaze for the space of 3 full seconds, the length of a fault line registering, the length of a stone landing in still water, the length of a janitor's nod in a hospital corridor that had once held a man together at the exact moment he needed to be held. Then he nodded back. Outside, the Veil Theory city moved through its afternoon patterns, vast and pale and organized, governing itself along principles that 2 species were still, carefully, learning to translate for each other. The alliance was 11 months old and fragile in 17 different ways that Marcus knew about and probably 30 more that he didn't. But in the chamber where a queen had just defended her throne with a dead woman's strategy and a human liaison officer's 3-second observation, something had shifted. Not politically. Politics shifted all the time. It was the nature of the enterprise. Something deeper than that. Something that didn't have a word in formal galactic common or elevated veil theory, or any register Marcus had been trained in. Something that lived in the space between a look held and a look returned. The kind of thing that, across all the species humanity had ever met or would ever meet, turned out to matter more than every treaty ever signed. The kind of thing that started, always, with one person simply not looking away. 2/2